Welcome to the Valcamonica Rock Art in 20 Minutes project. Today our topic is the rock engravings of Valcamonica, a short introduction. The rock art present in Valcamonica, an alpine valley between the provinces of Bergamo and Brescia, constitutes a historical, archaeological, ethnographic and artistic heritage of inestimable value, not only for its antiquity, but, above all, for its thematic and iconographic richness. Research indicates that the rock art of Valcamonica dates back to the end of Paleolithic, a tradition that proceeded continuously until the Romanization in the 1st century AD. However, at the beginning of the 28th century, only the Chemo boulders were known to the scientific world, discovered and published by the Brescian geographer Walter Lang, and that the local population called the rocks of the puppets, in dialect the Prede dei Pitoti, a term now sometimes used in Valcamonica to indicate rock engravings in general, although it is often used in a derogatory sense. Thanks to the discovery in 1964 of additional rock engravings on the eastern shore of Lake Garda, in the Torri del Benaco area, and in 1966 in Valtellina in the Grosio area, we can now identify the central eastern area of the Alps as having common stylistic, thematic and chronological characteristics, whose fulcrum, however, remains Valcamonica. But where are the engraved surfaces located and what types of rocks has been used for rock art? First of all, we must clarify that from a geological point of view, Valcamonica, like many alpine valleys, was shaped by the glaciers during the last 100,000 years. From Pisogne on the Iseo Lake up to Capo di Ponte Paspardo in the middle Valcamonica, the rocks, all smoothed and eroded by the glaciers, are made up of sandstone, and in some cases of limestone. From Sellero Grevo and in the High Valley and in Valtellina, the engraved surfaces are formed by phylladic schists, such as those of the Rupe Magna. On the Garda Lake there are limestone rocks. How were these rocks engraved? Most of the figurative tradition is made up of engravings created on open-air surfaces, with the more common percussion technique and less frequent scratching. Sometimes there are figures created with a mixture of techniques. To engrave the figures, lithic tools of our material were used, such as quartzite and gneiss and flint burins, as these objects has been found at the base of some of the engraved rocks. On the walls of shelters, some panels with paintings made in ochre and sometimes in charcoal were found, but this is a very rare phenomenon. After the first mention of the rock art by Lang, most of the discoveries in Valcamonica were published in the 30s by the archaeologist Raffaello Battaglia and the anthropologist Giovanni Marro, with contribution also by the Germans Franz Altheim and Erika Trautmann. After the Second World War, among others, Piero Leonardi, Emanuele Suess and Lang himself published some studies. In In 1955, the research of Lang and Suess and the decisive support of the archaeologist superintendent Mario Mirabella Roberti led to the foundation of the Naquane Rock Engravings National Park in Capo di Ponte, an area that included 104 engraved surfaces. A more scientific method in defining the different stages of the creation of the rock art was proposed between the second half of the 50s and in the middle of the 70s by Emanuele Anati, who, with his Centro Comune di Studi Preistorici founded in 1964, significantly advanced the discoveries of rock art in the valley and started a numerous series of monographic publications, as well as some exhibitions, the best known of which certainly remains I Comuni in Milan in 1982. Starting from the 70s, an approach for the study of rock art with stronger links to archaeology was proposed by Raffaele De Marinis of the University of Milan, who deepened his research especially on the Copper and Iron Ages, leading to some interesting publications, conferences, and important archaeological exhibitions, and launched a plan for the enhancement of the National Park of Rock Engravings in Naquane, which included the survey of the most important engraved rocks and a new experience for tourists to visit. This archaeological approach was also followed by his students who founded the archaeological cooperative Le Orme dell'Uomo in 1988 and widely spread the methods of the so-called Rupestrian archaeology in the valley and outside the valley through conferences, exhibitions, and the important Valcamonica Rock Art Field School, a rock art school held in Paspardo since 1988 and which has attracted thousands of students and rock art scholars to the valley. The two associations, the Le Orme dell'Uomo and the Centro Comune, are members of IFRAO, the International Federation of Rock Art Organizations, and jointly organized the important IFRAO 2018 International Congress in Darfo Boario Terme. For the 80s, we must also recognize the importance of the excavations in Breno Castle conducted by Francesco Fedele of the University of Naples, who also studied, for the first time in the Central Alps, a site with stele from the Copper Age. This is in Amboia in Ossimo, where a municipal archaeological park has been opened. In recent years, the activities of the Archaeological Superintendency of Lombardy has acquired an increasing weight through the conservation of the engraved rocks, with the research on the causes of their degradation, and the start of the IR Web cataloging, a monitoring campaign of the engraved rocks throughout Valcamonica. The same state body took care of the excavations at the site of the Cemo boulders and the Pat area in Ossimo. Research that led to the acquisition of a significant number of new steles and engraved boulders from the Copper Age that are now mostly preserved into the National Museum of Prehistory in Capo di Ponte. The superintendency also oversaw the implementation of the UNESCO Site Management Plan. The rock art of Valcamonica, in fact, thanks to Anati's proposal, became part of the World Heritage List in 1979. Coming to the periodization of the rock art of Valcamonica, The first phase, also called Proto-Camuno, dates back to the end of the Pleistocene, after the deglaciation, that is, to the last phase of the Upper Paleolithic, and to the beginning of the Holocene. These are figures of deer, moose and fish, sometimes large, often depicted with a certain dynamism. This art is in some way linked to the themes and chronologies of cave art and hunter-gatherers, and more recently it has been linked to similar rock art in sites outside of caves, the open-air Paleolithic rock art sites in Spain, France and Portugal. In the second phase, a period that can be dated between the Middle Neolithic and the Early Copper Age, we find instead spirals and topographic figures. The first representations in the territory whose creation on the rocks is perhaps linked to a real division of agricultural land sanctioned by a ritual practice, rock art. The third phase can be divided into two sub-phases, the first of which can be dated to the full Copper Age, in the 3rd millennium BC, when we see the appearance of the steles, menhirs and engraved boulders representing the first anthropomorphic divinities of the Alpine people. The most important is certainly the sun god, in some phases depicted as a man crowned by a radiated solar circle and associated with weapons. However, there are also two other characters, a female divinity, symbolized by the presence of numerous jewels, including pendant, necklace, and combs, and another male divinity covered by a cloak with fringes. During the Bell Beaker period, these three symbols are anthropomorphized in the stele. The iconographic repertoire of these steles is very rich. In addition to weapons, including daggers, axes and halberds, there are ploughing scenes, dance scenes, chariots, and numerous groups of animals, especially deer and caprids, which perhaps are to be linked to the idea of their own descent from mythical and deified progenitors, and often associated with the sun. The second subphase belongs to the 2nd millennium BC and corresponds to the Bronze Age. The iconographic repertoire is smaller than that of the Copper Age, but no less important. Apart from a number of schematic human praying figures, there are also numerous weapons, the same as those of the Copper Age, in example axes, halberds and daggers, but in this case no longer associated with divinity. New weapons, such as spears, swords and shields, are now also known. The ploughing scenes continue, the ritual scenes formed by praying humans, and new symbols, such as shovels and spiked wheels, appear. In the late Bronze Age, the first warriors also appeared in the iconographic repertoire, figures that prelude the vast repertoire present in the Iron Age, during the last millennium BC. This last phase of rock art, also called 4th period or 4th style, is the richest and the most interesting from a thematic point of view. This is an art probably linked to the initiatory rituals of the young warrior aristocracy, as can be seen from some scenes in which small duelists are flanked by referees, godparents or teachers, of larger dimensions and fully armed. In this phase we recognize hunting scene and ritual duels, armed races and dances, artifacts like buildings, chariots, and weapons, plowing scenes and symbols like the communion rose and the footprints. Divinities like Cernunnos and Taranis, and inscriptions in the communion alphabet, unfortunately not yet deciphered, but perhaps with a didactic meaning compared to the engravings to which they are associated. The Romans arrived in the valley in 16 BC. A legion under the command of Publio Silio Nerva was the first to subdue the tribes of the Euganei, namely Trimplini, Camuni and Vennonetes, in a single quick military campaign, as demonstrated by the inscription of these three names in the Tropaeum Alpium, the Trophy of the Alps, a monument built by Augustus in 76 BC in La Turbie in France. The interruption of the rock art tradition in the area probably started during the intensification of the Romanization process of the Flavian era. The style becomes static and rude. Figures are very schematic. The exhaustion of the social classes that held power until then, the growing economic, cultural and religious attraction that the Roman settlements must have aroused, in particular the new city near Cividate Camuno, reduced and finally annihilated the power of the communion aristocrat social classes. Until then, traditional motifs, ritual or otherwise, had constituted the iconographic heritage of rock engravings. With the arrival of Christianity, there was a return to the engraved areas, which are again decorated with motifs drawn from Christian symbolism: crosses, keys, shears, Solomon knots, warriors, castles, and obviously dates and inscriptions. Thanks, and we wait for you in the next Valcamonica Rock Art in 20